Welcome to the Hollywood Scholar. I'm Jed Morgan, and I just finished watching Orville New Horizons Twice Upon a Lifetime, and I really enjoyed this episode. It ties back into some of my favorite episodes of the previous couple seasons, especially the one about Gordon falling in love with the chick from the time capsule phone from 2015, and just their whole relationship is something that I really liked and really got into, and that character dynamic between the two of them, and just the idea of falling in love with someone hundreds of years before and then having to let her go because if he tried to edit her life, she wasn't the person that he fell in love with. But now he's got a chance to make that all right, because the other episodes this ties into are the time travel episodes from the end of season 2. And there was just a lot of cool stuff going on here. I love time travel. I love it as a sci-fi mechanic. I love it as a physics idea. I love researching everything about time travel. If you can't tell, I kind of like time travel. And it's a trope in sci-fi for a reason, but it's very difficult to get right. And so I get excited when I hear time travel is going to be involved, but also get very worried because if an untalented writer gets their hands on time travel, things can really just get messy, if nothing else. So there are some issues I had with this episode, even when it came to the time travel portion of it. I love the time travel, but there were some issues with it that I'll get into later. But before I get any further, there will be spoilers ahead, so spoiler alert. So yeah, this episode just sees Gordon in an accident getting sent back to 2015 and the crew having to save him. But when they get there, he's been there for 10 years and had fallen in love with the 2015 chick again and lived a life with her, had kids. The problem is that goes against the temporal law set up by the Union, which means that you're supposed to hide. You're supposed to make as little impact on the course of history as possible. And he broke that, especially by having children. And so the crew has to wrestle with whether or not to, forcibly take him back. And when that's not an option, they decided to make another jump in time and take him when he first lands in the past and prevent that future where he committed those temporal crimes. And then they get back to their time and, it's all good to go, resolving a lot of the issues of the episode. Now, I really like how this episode started. The party getting back with Gordon, who we hadn't focused on in a long time. The selfie to reconnect, the audience with the 2015 chick. And, it was a very simple scene, but I got a lot about a lot of different characters, especially Isaac and Charlie during that party sequence. Even Bortus got a little bit, though. Bortus' makeup was a little off. I'm not sure what it was. He just looked a little different. It didn't look bad. It was just different. Not sure what that was about. And the battle sequence with the Kalon was actually really good. The CGI was great. The combat, the way that they thought through how to get out of these situations. I always love when sci-fi comes with these cool solutions to things that still kind of make sense, at least to a non-scientifically oriented mind. It sounds like what they're doing makes sense. So I loved a lot of that, and it was all because the Kalons were after the time travel device that the Orville had just recently perfected. Then, of course, during the battle, they send out a wave from the deflectors to get free from the tractor beam, which activates the time travel device, and that's what sends Gordon to the past. And that sequence was cool, really liked all that. And the time travel mechanics of it do have a couple issues that I wanted to get into. It was a good vehicle to get the story started, and that's kind of when time travel is at its best. But they don't really think through the paradoxes that much. Whenever someone is sent to the past, you never, ever, ever look up what happened to them because they saw that he died at 93 in a news article or something. They looked up a news article about him from that time period. And that's something you never want to do because depending on the time travel mechanics of the universe, and they even admit that they don't understand time travel enough to have a firm grasp on which mechanics exist. In some, the moment you know something is the moment that it becomes fact. So if you just kind of pretend, or at least, prevent yourself from knowing any facts from someone you sent back in time, you might still be able to get back and rescue them before any evidence is left behind. And so, yeah, definitely didn't want to do that. And then later on in the episode, they didn't even bother to go pick up Gordon after he sends the message for them, which would create a paradox. If he never sent the message to the Orville to pick him up, why was the Orville there in the first place? They should have at least picked him up 3 months after he landed instead of just 1 month, because that creates a major paradox. Not to mention the paradox of them being 10 years in his future with the kids and the family and then deciding to go rescue him in the past. That takes a major paradox because they would never have done that if they haven't interacted with the older version. There's just a lot of paradoxes, and just saying it's in flux isn't necessarily a good enough answer to get over the paradoxes, especially when they kept bringing up oh, that would create a paradox. At the beginning of the episode, they went to the effort of saying, hey, this is what a paradox is, this is what would cause it. And they don't even bother to incorporate it into the story. I think that would have been a lot better if they were wrestling with the paradoxes of it. Another aspect that I was a bit conflicted on, that I liked aspects of but didn't like other aspects, is the moral question of whether or not they had the right to erase Malloy's family, Gordon's family, from the timeline by going back and rescuing him when he was young. And they don't go into enough detail about it. Like, they're like, oh, you're a criminal, you don't have any rights anymore, but there's two lives that exist in this timeline that didn't exist before, and that means something, that matters. So I would have at least liked to have them have the conversation. Like, maybe Kelly was like, no, the law is the law, we have to go and undo all this. But Ed's like, it's my best friend's kid, and the kid exists. Like, have a conversation about it. Wrestle with the moral repercussions of erasing children from existence. They do a little bit at the end of the episode. He mentions he feels guilty about it, but before he makes the decision, they all need to sit down and have a talk about it and being like, what we're about to do, it may be the right thing to do. It may be the moral thing to do. It may be what the union would want us to do, but does it feel right? They just need to go a little bit more into detail about it, especially because they brought it up in the end. Similar to the time travel thing, they brought these issues up enough that they should have addressed them. Why bring them up if you're not going to address them in the cases of both the paradox and the morality of the decision they made in the finale? They just didn't really go into enough detail about either. So I had issues with that. They just needed one scene before erasing Malloy's 10-year future from history. They just needed to do a little bit more, in my opinion, at least. And as someone who really likes time travel, both of those elements would have gone a long way for me to approve the time travel of this episode. Overall, I think it does good as a vehicle to get back into that relationship with Gordon and the 2015 chick, but otherwise the time travel is severely broken in this episode, and that's very disappointing to me as someone who loves time travel. Just a few other quick things. I do love Alara, I believe her name is. I can never remember the Selaine security guard's name. Her and Lamar's relationship, I kind of like their chemistry, and they kind of went farther in that. Definitely like to see the advancement of that. Gordon's speech when they're in like the nursery or whatever, and he's like, we're all human, we need human contact. We would all die. If you were in the situation that I was, you would make the same decisions. That was just a great speech that summed up why he did the things he did. We didn't necessarily need it to understand why he made his decisions, but it was a good speech to like fully flesh it out and really understand where he was coming from. And it makes sense. I mean, if you had been living in the mountains on your own for 3 years with zero human contact, with no hope of rescue, with no chance of relief, I think we all would have gone a little bit mad and made the same decisions he made in the end. So I think that speech was just really good to drive it home. And the only problem with that speech is it didn't affect Ed and Kelly whatsoever, because that speech could have been the catalyst they needed to have that conversation that I mentioned earlier about the moral repercussions of the decisions that they were about to make. I think it would have been important that that speech was what made them sit down and be like, all right, are we doing the right thing here? Are we doing what needs to be done? Like balancing out the different mentalities and different philosophies of the rule of law, the union versus what feels right, happiness of a friend. There's just a lot of conversations that needed to be had, but that speech was a good one. It just didn't facilitate the things it should have been able to. Something that's been theorized since the first episode of this new season is if Charlie was gay, if she was in love with that other ensign who gave her life for Charlie to escape the battle with the Kalons. And, you know, I wasn't initially thinking that she was, but in this episode, the way they brought it about, the way that she came out basically to Isaac, I think was very effectively done and done, you know, well. So I don't have any problems with that. I think it actually adds quite a bit to her hatred of Isaac, fleshing that out, making us understand her character quite a bit more. I still do believe that that flashback sequence of the other ensign giving her life for Charlie does create some issues, especially because Charlie just kind of, you know, it's like, no, I'm going to do it. And then she's pushed back and she's like, you know what, you die. That's fine. And that flashback is where a lot of the issues come from. When a hero is in a situation like that, they need to be incapacitated or trapped in some sense so that they're not morally held responsible for letting the other person give their lives to rescue you. Like you've got to do something. Maybe the other ensign had stunned her. Maybe he had like tied her to the chair or something. It just needed to be something to get her out of the moral repercussions of the situation. She didn't. She just sat there and let her, you know, at this point, the woman she loves kill herself to save her, and she did nothing. I think that was that scene still causes quite a few issues, but I did like how they had her come out in this episode, and then the way that they addressed it. It didn't seem over the top. It didn't seem pandering. It just seemed to make the most sense for her character, and I probably would make the same decision as the writers of this episode did. So no problems with that, even though I didn't initially think that that was the case. I do like how it turned out in the end. And then the final two things, I really like the goodbye sequence between older Gordon and his new family. It's like, I will always love you. There was very emotional, very good chemistry between the three of them. And, they're accepting that they're going to be erased from history. That's not something that you can fight. You can't fight the marching of time. So there was nothing that they could do. They just had to give in and hope that their love was enough to get them through what was about to come. So that sequence was really good. And then, of course, the kind of idea and the visual effects presented in how they traveled back to the future with the Einstein relativity thing. I thought that was actually very interesting, a very cool idea that I never really thought about in a Star Trek sense, is that the future is a lot easier to go to than the past because of relativity. And so, yeah, really like that sequence, and that's kind of how the episode closed out, was them getting back to the present. And they had a few conversations about feeling guilty, but it really wasn't to the degree to, sell home the emotional impact of what they were discussing, and it needed to be discussed earlier, like I've mentioned a few times now. Overall, I did really enjoy this episode. I did enjoy some aspects of the time travel in this episode, and by far the best part of this was older Gordon with his family, and just their interactions together were very solid and very heartfelt, and I really enjoyed them. I'd have to give this episode a 7 out of 10, probably the lowest I've given the season so far, mainly because the time travel mechanics are broken, and Kelly and Ed are not characters in this episode. They were merely facilitators of the law. I think if they just had those conversations about the moral repercussions of the actions that they were taking, it would add quite a bit to the story. The Isaac and Charlie stuff, very solid, very good, but the Ed and Kelly stuff, arguably the two main characters, had a lot of screen time, but did absolutely zero for character, and then the time travel mechanics were destroyed. Between those two elements, it just really hurt this episode in quite a few ways. So that's kind of what I thought of the episode. Maybe you guys disagree with me. Maybe the issues that I said didn't really affect you guys to the same degree, but anyway, that's all I have for today. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Anon. If you like what I do here and want to see good, compelling stories that Hollywood will no longer give you, check out my book series, Odyssey of a Phoenix, a mythological epic about philosophy, morality, and modern-day mental illness issues. Books 1, Down in Flames, and Book 2, Apocalypse Then, currently on sale. Book 3, Kill the Dark, coming soon.